Hey YouTube, this is Bryce again. Today am coming to talk to you about, I wanted to argue for free will over determinism, because I think it's a rather interesting topic. And for the purposes here in my argument, we'll be defining determinism as essentially saying, well, if you look at the material world around us, we see that matter is mechanical and determinate. It follows these set laws. And, well, humans, they are wholly material, of course, and therefore they are not free from these laws. And this means that the explanatory origin of any action we take has its genesis in something outside ourselves, and that therefore, since free will is defined as the origin of our actions, or at least some of our actions coming from within ourselves and free from any prior causes, that means we don't have free will because of determinism. But I take a problem with that because essentially my argument will be looking at the fact that we have two distinct sets of experience. We have this experience of the internal world, such that, it's essentially our sense of the fact that we have a mind, that we have emotions, and that we reason, and that we have free will, or at least the sense of that. And this is apparently opposed to the external world, or experience of the external world, in which we see that matter is mechanical and determinate, obeys law like regularities, etc., etc. We can describe with mathematical equations. And typically we accept both, unless we see any reason that there should be a contradiction. And oftentimes we think there would be a contradiction because of some prior worldview we have, but that's actually a whole other topic I'll talk about in another video. But I think determinism, the problem with it is that it's essentially an exception in the way we usually operate in accepting and determining whether or not we should accept our senses as being actually corresponding to what we're sensing, or if they're just an illusion. So I want to point out that the determinist argument, or at least as it's usually presented about matter being mechanical and determinate, is dependent upon our senses of the external world being true, and that they are not illusory. And this is usually set up in opposition to our experience of the internal world, in order to say, well, if this is our experience of the external world, and if we accept it as true, then we would have to say that this experience we have of the internal world is essentially epiphenomenal or illusory. We sense something that's really happening, but our interpretation of it is false. And I think that such an argument, because it's a posteriori, is question-begging. It revolves around an essential assumption about our ability to accept our experiences of the external world as valid, while at the same time holding our experience of the internal world as able to come under scrutiny, or at least a better scrutiny than that of the external world. So I want to look at this kind of like Descartes looked at his the whole schemata of senses in his first and second meditations. And of course, you know the story about Descartes. He had the world of senses, and he said, how do I know that they're not all illusory, that what I'm sensing isn't really there? And he said, well, I have this sense of the internal world, and that I am thinking, and that therefore I must exist, etc., etc. And that's how that's the kind of framework I want to work with to look at this. And so we have these two sets of experience, the internal world and the external world. And what I think we should accept is that there's two ways of arguing for things. That you have a priori reasons and a posteriori reasons. And a priori reasons would be reasons to accept some sort of premise as true, regardless of any sense experience. And a posteriori would be pending on our ability to say a certain experience is valid. So if a priori we have no reason to believe the senses of our external world, any argument that's dependent upon our experience of the external world being valid or non-illusory would therefore be false, or at least be put under extreme doubt, simply because, well, it would be operating on something we haven't actually shown to be true. And I think that to proceed, we should say, well, we have this internal world experience and this external world experience, and that any reason a priori to accept one set of experiences is also good enough to accept the other set of experiences, such that you can't come up with a posteriori reasons to argue against another set of experiences. Because this is what the determinist is doing. They are saying, first, let us assume that our experience of the external world is licit, and that therefore we can throw into question our experience of the external world. Our experience of the internal world, in order to say, well, this experience of free will that we have is illusory. It doesn't actually resemble something that is really happening. And the problem with that, of course, is that I think it's question-begging, because it's based on some sort of assumption by which they're able to know about the external world while also not knowing about the internal world. And to illustrate, I think that conceptually, someone could come along and argue, well, I could just argue that the world we experience external to us is false because we have this experience of free will, and because it doesn't correspond to our experience of the external world, the experience of the external world must be false. And that's just sort of playing the same reasoning of the determinist against himself. And what I'm about to say is essentially, a person who accepts one set of experiences has to accept both sets of experiences, the internal and the external. And that you can't use one set of experiences to argue against the other set of experiences, because it would be inherently question-begging, because it would be reliant on this a posteriori reasoning based on the assumption of accepting one while also not accepting the other.